Summer was in full swing at Bellevue Park, a residential complex known for its calm and pleasant atmosphere. The late afternoon sun bathed the pool in golden light, creating the perfect ambience for relaxing after a day of work. Thomas, a 32-year-old software engineer, found himself in precisely this situation. His most demanding project was finally finished, and he savored every minute of this rare moment of respite. He was comfortably seated on a lounge chair, his favorite book in his hands, and an iced lemonade within reach. The sun's rays gently slid across his sunglasses, and a light wind brought a pleasant breeze, brushing his face. Everything seemed perfect, a stark contrast to the frenzy of the past weeks. But this tranquility would quickly be shattered. At first there was only a slight sound of footsteps, a crunching on the concrete slabs. It was an almost imperceptible sound, but it was distinct in the still evening air. Thomas looked up automatically, and his eyes met a familiar silhouette. A woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with statement sunglasses and a demeanor that exuded unquestionable authority. Although he had seen her several times in the complex, they had never exchanged a word. She always seemed to be surrounded by this aura that commanded respect, but today, something else in her behavior captured Thomas's attention. He sat up slightly, perplexed. The woman approached with measured steps, her gaze fixed on him insistently, and stopped abruptly a short distance away. A heavy silence settled between them, like a scene from a film, where every word had its importance. A furtive glance, a perceptible hesitation. Then she asked the question directly, almost too directly. "Excuse me, do you live here?" Thomas, surprised, sat up a little straighter, his defensive instinct awakening in the face of this unexpected intrusion. However, he remained calm, responding calmly. "Yes, I live in apartment 304. I've been here for 2 years." He even allowed himself a slight smile, thinking that this clarification would be enough to calm the situation. But the woman narrowed her eyes, as if she didn't believe him for a second, searching his face with a new intensity. There was nothing kind about the look she gave him. "I've never seen you here. Are you sure you're not visiting anyone?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion, a hint of defiance in the words. The intonation of his voice, haughty and sharp, resonated in the heavy afternoon air. Thomas felt a slight tingle of frustration, a feeling he didn't like, but he kept his composure, his tone becoming firmer. "No, I live here, and I have nothing to prove to you." He felt like the exchange was taking a strange turn, but he didn't want to get bogged down in unnecessary explanations. He didn't feel responsible for justifying his presence. The woman doesn't give up. She crossed her arms in an authoritative gesture, looking convinced that something was wrong. Her gaze was incisive. She probed him as if hoping for an error, a flaw. "Then show me your key card." Her request sounded like an order, a challenge that she openly threw at him. Thomas turned pale for a moment, an unpleasant shiver running down his spine. He understood well where this discussion was going to take him, and he was not prepared to be intimidated. The request was absurd, he knew, but he felt the tension rising within him, a dull anger beginning to be felt. He took a deep breath, his gaze hardening slightly. Although he was a calm and thoughtful man, he was not going to let himself be humiliated like this. He slowly got up from his deck chair, facing this woman who seemed convinced of her own superiority. "I don't owe you any explanation. If you have a problem, contact management." The coldness of his voice contrasted with the heat of the sun. But the woman didn't stop there. Far from settling for her verbal confrontation, she pulled out her phone with almost threatening determination, her fingers tapping the screen with calculated speed. She dialed a number without hesitation, the situation taking a turn he hadn't anticipated. She raised the phone to her ear and, in a clear, authoritative voice, she called security. "There is someone at the pool who has no business being there. He claims he lives here, but I'm sure he doesn't." She pronounced these words in a detached tone, as if she were pointing out an anomaly, making a simple administrative report. Her gaze didn't leave Thomas, and he felt the bite of her accusatory gaze penetrate his mind. The words echoed in the air, heavy with implication. Thomas felt a wave of humiliation rise within him, the absurdity of the situation hitting him hard. How could a simple, banal encounter have degenerated to this point? Why did this woman, whom he had never seen up close, seem so determined to demean him? Frustration and anger pooled in his stomach, but he wasn't going to give in.
Not now.
Not in front of all this silent audience. He felt the eyes falling on him, heavy, inquisitive. Some were curious, scanning the scene as if it were a live drama. Others remained indifferent, as if nothing would disturb their perfect world. But a few, less discreet, cast disapproving glances, exchanging murmurs among themselves. These murmurs, although weak at the beginning, became heavier and heavier, more and more insistent. The tension spread like a silent, suffocating wave, ready to burst at any moment. Thomas felt like a trapped animal, his movements monitored, his slightest gestures scrutinized. He could almost hear the rumble of voices in the air, as if they were growing louder as the situation escalated. He turned his gaze towards the front door of the complex, hoping that security wouldn't arrive in force. But deep down, he knew the ordeal wasn't over yet. If security came, it wouldn't be a simple discussion. It would be a confrontation. The woman, now leaning against a column a few meters away from him, continued to talk on the phone, her gaze still fixed on him, her expression like that of a person who believed herself to be in a position of power. Fear of the unknown, fear of what would come next, was building within him, but he was not going to give in. He squared his shoulders, his hands becoming soft fists. His eyes scanned the surroundings. Some residents of the complex had stopped swimming and were now openly staring at him. Others were quietly sipping their drinks, but he could sense some palpable unease in the air. They knew something was wrong, that this scene was inappropriate. Thomas took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving the woman, and forced himself to remain calm. He knew that if the situation escalated, there could be consequences. But he was not going to be the victim of this kind of humiliation. He was not this stranger, this intruder who could be chased away with a simple phone call. It wasn't him who should leave, but this woman, this attitude, this injustice. The woman's voice rang out again, almost triumphant. Yes, he's still there. Yes, he doesn't seem to be a resident. She added more, each word like a spear that she stuck a little deeper into his ego. The security guard arrived shortly after, a young man in his 20s, clearly disturbed by the scene unfolding before him. He seemed like a novice, not yet used to this kind of confrontation. His uniform was impeccable, but his expression betrayed a certain hesitation, as if he was unsure of what to do in such a tense situation. The woman, still standing firm, immediately accused Thomas of trespassing, her words sharp as blades. He has nothing to do here. He is not a resident. She pointed at him, as if the simple accusation was enough to prove her guilt. His tone was haughty, almost contemptuous, and his eyes flashed in Thomas's direction. The agent, after a moment of hesitation, turned to Thomas, visibly trapped between two contradictory versions. Perhaps he wasn't yet used to dealing with this kind of tension. With an almost hesitant gesture, he approached Thomas and asked him politely, but firmly, "Can you prove that you are indeed a resident here?" Thomas felt a pang in his heart. This was the moment he would have to face this questioning of his existence in this place he had called home for 2 years. His gaze hardened, and with a calm but determined movement, he reached into his pockets. His fingers slid first to his phone, then he pulled out his key card and driver's license. He slowly handed them to the guard, his gaze still fixed on the woman, but his mind remained focused on the situation. The agent examined the documents with a scrutinizing air. The silence was oppressive, as if the entire complex had held its breath, awaiting the young man's decision. After a moment of hesitation, the agent looked up and nodded slowly, confirming what Thomas already knew. Everything was in order. His papers were valid. He was indeed a resident here, and there was nothing wrong with that. But the woman, as if the humiliation she felt pushed her to fight to the end, was not ready to give up. She crossed her arms, her lips pursed, and anger showed on her face. "You're just going to take his word for it?" His voice was full of disdain, as if simply showing documents wasn't enough to calm his inner certainty that something was wrong. She could not conceive that a man, perhaps less in line with her expectations, could actually be a resident in this complex. His accusatory tone hung in the air, almost contemptuous, like a final attempt to discredit Thomas. Before the agent could respond, an authoritative voice spoke from across the pool. It came from a place where no one seemed to have stopped to observe the scene, but the voice, firm and resolute, cut through the growing turmoil of the moment. "That's enough." Everyone turned to the source of this interjection, an older woman, dressed in a light summer dress and a wide-brimmed hat, who stood out from the shadow of the large parasol. His movements were slow, but with an imposing grace. His gaze, however, had nothing gentle. She stepped forward with a determined step, and her eyes fixed the accusing woman with icy firmness. A chill of anticipation ran through the air, the other residents instinctively moving away to make room for this new speaker. "You've been harassing people for months. You've never stopped." Isabel's voice was calm, but each word struck with the precision of a hammer blow. "Last week you called security on a delivery guy, and the other day you had the police involved in college kids moving into their apartment." Isabel's words, measured but sharp, penetrated the tense atmosphere of the pool like an electric shock. The accusing woman tensed under the pressure of listing her actions, her face contorting into a grimace of disdain. She wanted to respond, but Isabel, implacable, continued in the same tone, maintaining perfect control of the situation. "You're the only one with something to prove here. You harass people based on your own distrust. And that's enough." The last sentence rang through the air with the authority of a definitive conclusion. The accusing woman, still frozen in a posture of defiance, no longer knew how to respond. A heavy silence settled in, heavy with judgment. It was obvious that Isabel's intervention had upset the balance of the scene. Little by little, murmurs were heard around the pool. Some residents began to exchange knowing glances, whispering among themselves. Others shook their heads in disapproval. The looks that now turned towards the woman were full of judgment, disapproval, and weariness. It was no longer a question of who was right or wrong, but rather how this woman had abused her position and power, sowing discord among her neighbors. Security, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated for a moment. The young agent, who seemed to no longer have any control over the situation, just nodded, looking embarrassed. He finally turned towards the exit without another word, while observing Isabel from the corner of his eye, as if he was looking for some form of validation in her behavior. The accusing woman sat up abruptly, visibly destabilized by the turn of events. A flash of frustration crossed her face, and in a final burst of pride, she muttered, almost imperceptibly, "This is absurd." But her words, devoid of conviction, were lost in the heavy air, like an attempt to hold on to a reality that was collapsing around her. Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and hurriedly headed towards the exit of the pool, her heels clicking against the ground, her pace still stiff, but defeat marked in every gesture. The scene, previously so tense, slowly dissipated, and a certain lightness settled into the atmosphere. But the echo of the confrontation remained, like a wave still perceptible in the air. Thomas, who had observed the whole scene with silent gratitude, then turned to Isabel. He wasn't one to ask for help, let alone wait for intervention, but what had just happened had completely changed the dynamic. He had found a form of dignity that he thought was lost in this whirlwind of injustice. "Thank you, you don't have to get involved," he said with a shy but sincere smile. Isabel, who was obviously not there to seek recognition, smiled back, but it was a quiet, almost modest smile. She shrugged casually, as if what she had just done was simply the right thing to do, without further thought. "Someone had to do it, but you transformed it into something bigger." Isabel's words were simple, but they resonated in Thomas's mind. She had not only intervened to restore order, she had changed the balance of things in a more profound way. She had given this situation a meaning that went well beyond the simple confrontation between two individuals. She had shown that intolerance, injustice and blind distrust could not be tolerated, and that sometimes the voice of a single individual could be enough to turn the situation around. Thomas wasn't sure who Isabel really was, but he had a hunch that she saw much more than she let on. He didn't thank her further, because he knew that this kind of help didn't require words. But he had the impression at that precise moment that something had just changed for him, and perhaps for all those who witnessed the scene. A few minutes after the incident at the swimming pool, a young resident of Bellevue Park, Jules, who had witnessed the scene in silence, decided to film the entire exchange. He published the video on his social networks, without realizing the impact it would have. Within hours, the video went viral, reaching thousands of views and sparking chain reactions across all platforms. Comments multiplied not only in the neighborhood, but also across the country and even beyond borders. The video highlighted an incident of blatant racial profiling, and in an instant, Thomas found himself in the spotlight, an unwilling symbol of dignity in the face of systemic injustice. It didn't take long for the wave of support to arrive. People of all origins, from all walks of life, expressed their solidarity with Thomas, who, in the public eye, had become much more than a simple victim of an isolated situation. He now embodied the many victims of invisible discrimination, those who, every day, are judged on the basis of prejudices, stereotypes, and irrational fears. Debates about systemic racism, profiling, and social exclusion ignited social networks, television channels, and even conversations in offices and schools. What seemed like a local incident had just turned into a national conversation. Reactions became more nuanced when the manager of the complex, Ms. Lefevre, called an urgent meeting the next day with Thomas and Marianne, the accusing woman. This meeting, in the minds of all, would be an opportunity to clarify the facts and impose consequences on what, in the eyes of the majority, was an unacceptable discriminatory attitude. The setting of the meeting was formal, but the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Marianne, clearly embarrassed by the magnitude of the situation, presented herself with crossed arms, her gaze shifting, while Thomas stood, still dignified, ready to face the consequences of public exposure. The discussion quickly turned to the need to apologize, but things didn't go that smoothly. Marianne, although forced to admit that she had acted unjustifiably, tried to minimize her actions. She still did not appear to have fully understood the scope of her actions, defending herself by citing her good intentions and her concern for the security of the complex. But this time, Thomas didn't just defend himself. He spoke in a way he had not before, firmly asserting that prejudice, whatever its form, could not be excused by misplaced intentions or misplaced concerns. The manager, Ms. Lefevre, who until then had kept a neutral position, finally intervened to remind us that Bellevue Park must be a place of respect, inclusiveness, and security for all its residents, without exception. She explained that this incident could not simply be ignored or swept under the rug. It required not only an apology for Marianne, but also a formal acknowledgement of the impact of her behavior on the community. But beyond the immediate confrontation, Ms. Lefevre also announced the initiation of an awareness and training program for all residents in order to prevent future similar incidents. This event marked a turning point at Bellevue Park. The management of the incident was not limited to a simple confrontation between two people, but became the catalyst for a broader process of collective reflection. It was an opportunity to challenge discriminatory practices and foster a more inclusive approach within the community. A group of residents, inspired by the incident, comes together to hold workshops on residents' rights, diversity, and inclusion. New channels of communication were opened, allowing everyone to share their concerns without fear of judgment. The following month, a certain change took place within the community. No one felt left out of important discussions, and prejudices, while still present, were now being challenged more openly. The feeling of belonging was strengthened, and solidarity initiatives between residents, regardless of their origin or status, flourished throughout the complex. What began as an isolated incident at the Bellevue Park swimming pool thus transformed into a real lever for social transformation, proving that even the most trivial events could, when brought to light, lead to profound changes. Thomas, although he had not sought to become a spokesperson, had shown the community that injustice could be fought with dignity and calm, and that solidarity could arise where it was expected. The least. The incident at the swimming pool, far from marking the end of its history, had initiated the beginning of a new era of understanding and respect at Bellevue Park.